Welcome, everyone. If you're just here for the first time, welcome. And if you were here yesterday, double welcome. Yesterday was a terrific success, we all thought, and we're looking forward to ending this all strong. As you know from looking at the handouts, the design today is a little bit different. We will have Suzanne's talk between 2 and 3:30, counting the questions that Megan mentioned, then a 30-minute break, and then come back at 4 to 5 for the roundtable, at which the participants may ask each other questions, or any and all of the people who have been zooming in can ask questions. And we're hoping for a very hearty discussion at that point. It's my great pleasure to be able to be the one to introduce Suzanne Conklin Akbari at this point. She is a professor of medieval studies at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. But before that, she was for many years very highly successful as professor of English and the director of the Center for Medieval Studies at Toronto. If you look at her webpage, it will tell you that she works on things like cultural contact and epistemology in the global Middle Ages. And it occurs to me that that doesn't really say enough. So I poked around a little bit. And one thing I turned up is she has been the holder of major grants. And I don't mean small ones, I mean major ones, which are both, in a sense, affirmations of the importance of what she does. And this is from the Mellon Foundation and the Social Sciences and Research Council of Canada. Affirmation of the importance of what she does, but also, obviously, they enable her to keep going, which is a terrific option and opportunity that we all know of in academics, if you can get it. Another thing that jumps out is that her work can be found in lots of articles and books. The two best known books are probably Idols in the East, European Representations of Islam in the Orient, 1100 to 1450, which is Cornell 2009. And then Seeing Through the Veil, Optical Theory and Medieval Allegory, which is Toronto 2004. Only this year, she co-edited with James Simpson the Oxford Handbook of Chaucer. And she is at work on two books, one on Chaucer, Christine de Pizan and Metaphor, and one on the structuring of world histories between the First Crusade and the fall of Constantinople. And it occurred to me that that still doesn't say enough. And so I thought I would just say a little bit about what really stands out to me in the work. And I've had the opportunity to read quite a bit of it. One thing, first and foremost, the writing is clear and elegant in a way that is actually refreshingly novel sometimes in academics today. She writes extraordinarily well in and of itself, whatever it is she's writing. It is theoretically nuanced. It is historically informed. And it's very intellectually agile. It's not like you hear the tumblers fall, but you can see where she's going and you say, aha, of course, that's where we have to go. In a way, I think the most striking testament to this is, to my mind, in a sense, she seems to have reinvented herself multiple times during the course of her career. The book on Seeing Through the Veil, 2004, is about metaphor and literature. 5 years later, she came out with Idols in the East, which is about the pre-modern backgrounds of Orientalist stereotypes. And she is now working on the global medieval. And there's a kind of reinvention, as I say, that goes on in breathtaking ways. It occurs to me that academics, like a lot of professions maybe, has certain trends and cliches we like to circulate. So for a while, everything was robust. Discussions were robust. Votes for department chairs were robust. Candidate pools, the applicant pools were robust. Everything was robust. And then we were pivoting a lot too. We pivoted in plans, we pivoted in teaching, we pivoted in expectations. And the latest one of these cliches that I keep hearing is that people aren't just innovative, but they're field changing. And the problem with cliches is not that they're overused, but that sometimes they're accurate. And in Suzanne's case, field changing really is accurate. Medieval studies is different now, based on the things that Suzanne Conklin Akbari has written. And there are precious few people about whom that can be said, that the profession would be different if they had not written. So it gives me terrific pleasure. It's a great honor to be able to introduce Racializing Religions, The Case of the Ethiopian Magus and the Jews of Cologne by Suzanne Conklin Akbari.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that embarrassingly kind introduction. I'm going to begin sharing my screen. Let's put that up. Can you all see that image? Okay. Thank you so much, Tim, for the introduction and also for the invitation to speak today. Also like to thank Megan and Thompson for organizing this event so smoothly and so beautifully. And finally, I'd like to thank Sara, Lipton, and Whitaker, who opened up the topic of race and racialization so fully and so richly during yesterday's presentations. It's a privilege to deliver a lecture in this series along with you, although I have to confess to being more than a little intimidated to be speaking as the third in this series. I'm going to try my best to complement the material that you've both presented and hopefully to begin to draw together some of the strands that have emerged over this last day. Looking forward to the roundtable discussion afterward, where we'll discuss the topic of race in the Middle Ages in more detail. So my title is Racializing Religion, the Case of the Ethiopian Magus and the Jews of Cologne. In using the term racialization, I aim to emphasize the process of making race, what Whitaker has called, borrowing a term from Hannah Arendt, race thinking. I'll return to the relationship of these two terms, race making and race thinking, a little later. Right now, what I want to highlight is the sense of process, the coming into being that underlies the perception of racial difference and the idea of race. Often understood as something immutable, genetic, written on the body, race is a system of categorization and control. We make race, we think race, simply by virtue of being embedded in the world that we're in. At the same time, as medievalists, we're historians. We aim to take stock of the specific conditions of different places and different times. For this reason, and perhaps for other reasons, there's a profound tension that underlies current work on histories of race and racialization. This is something that Cord and I worked on together last year as we co-convened a series of seminars at the Institute for Advanced Study on the topic of race, racialization, and periodization. We came up repeatedly against the challenges that are posed by scholarship that is informed by critical race theory, and which therefore emphasizes the continuity of pre-modern and modern manifestations of race thinking, to studies of race that emphasize the disjunction of pre-modern and modern manifestations. In other words, we face this dilemma. Should we understand race as a specifically modern construct that emerges in the Enlightenment era, building on the foundations of pre-modern concepts of bodily diversity and alterity? Or should we understand it as a perennial phenomenon that emerges in a historically contingent way in different places and times? This may seem like a small point, but it has emerged as a point of debate and even conflict within medievalist scholarship. The nature of that choice, whether it emphasized continuity or disjunction with regard to race and racialization, is made starkly evident in one of David Nirenberg's thoughtful articles on the topic of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. In this piece, one of 3 articles by Nirenberg that revisit this topic in different ways with varied approaches and with fruitful results, he writes this. So this is a quotation from Nirenberg. He says, "There will always be strategic reasons for choosing to represent the relationship of ideas about the natural reproduction of culture that are scattered across time and space in terms of filiations or, conversely, in terms of disjuncture. Yet this choice can only be situational and polemical, in the sense that its recognition of significance springs from the needs and struggles of a specific moment. The polemics produced by such choices are invaluable when they stimulate us to comparison and self-consciousness. If, however, we treat them as anything but strategic, we simply exchange one lack of consciousness for another," end quote. In other words, Nirenberg seems to be suggesting it depends on what you're trying to do. If your primary concern is to shed some light on the pre-modern past, it might be appropriate to emphasize disjuncture, to see bodily diversity or representations of alterity as distinct from, yet intimately related to, modern manifestations of what we could call race. If, however, your concern is also ethical, related to how the past informs phenomena that occur in today's world, there might be a very good reason to understand these pre-modern manifestations of bodily diversity as precisely race. The decision, Nirenberg says, is strategic. I would suggest that this choice and the disciplinary tensions that inform it underlie some of the scholarly conversations that have followed the appearance of Geraldine Heng's important book, The Invention of Race, in 2018. This book initially aroused 2 kinds of response, which were strongly correlated with disciplinary affiliation. There were many extremely positive responses, especially from people in literature departments, where critical race theory had already begun to have significant impact, particularly within early modern literary studies. And there were also some negative, even dismissive responses, often in private, more seldom in public, mostly from people in history departments or those in art history with a strongly historicist orientation. That's a generalization, but that's the big picture. The bifurcated nature of this response has begun to change, with substantial yet respectful critiques of Hang's work beginning to appear from those working within literary studies, even while a more serious engagement with her book and with pre-modern critical race theory more generally has emerged on the part of historians. For example, the lecture series organized at Princeton this year by the Medievalists of Color, along with 3 academic programs, specifically has the mandate to focus on the impact of pre-modern critical race theory within the discipline of history, both in North America and in Europe. In other words, while some historians may be late in coming to engage with pre-modern critical race theory, even as others like the wonderful Nicole Lopez Janssen are already deep into this work, the situation is improving. I've sketched out this very brief reception history of Hang's invention of race in order to highlight the role that disciplinary formations play within our discussion of the histories of race and racialization. It's not the case, certainly, that a person's disciplinary affiliation dictates whether or not they embrace critical race theory. It is the case, though, that disciplines shape the way we approach our object of study, what we consider to be important or trivial, what methodologies seem appropriate to us, and the way we structure our arguments. Our disciplines, precisely, discipline us. They define what is thinkable or unthinkable. It's therefore up to us, as medievalists, to give an account of our own situatedness, both in individual terms and in terms of our disciplinary environment, and to ground our own research practices in this local way. This is a complicated enough task for those working in literature history and art history. For those working in fields that explicitly foreground the nexus of religious and racial identities, and here I'm thinking particularly of Jewish studies and Islamic studies, the task is even more complex. I want to approach this question of discipline, how we are disciplined, what is thinkable and what is unthinkable, through an exploration of the nexus of religious orientation and racial difference. This is a topic that has been beautifully treated in Cord's book, Black Metaphors, and is a topic that I also treated at some length in Idols in the East. I think I mainly still agree with the argument I made in that book, though I'd like to nuance it in certain ways for today's purposes. I also want to move away from the overarching general argument I made about race and religion in that book to instead present a very local, intimate approach to the nexus of religion and race, located on the ground of one particular city in Germany, Cologne. Drawing on the representation of the Ethiopian as presented in the narrative of the Three Kings of Cologne, a Latin text that was disseminated in a range of late medieval vernacular adaptations and translations, I'll seek to give an account of how racial difference was lined up with confessional identity in the Black Magus. Composed in the Rhineland during the mid-14th century, this text may have been produced to commemorate an important anniversary of the arrival in Cologne's cathedral of the most sacred and popular relics of the 3 wise men, or Magi. I'll juxtapose this text's account of Ethiopian Christian identity with the ways in which religious and racial identity intersected in another community, one that had a significant presence in Cologne in antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages, with some interruptions. That is, the historical Jewish population of the city. By lining up the nexus of religion and race as it appears in the figure of the Black Magus with the nexus of religion and race as it appears in connection with Jewish identity, I'll try to problematize and perhaps shed some light on how these discursive formations interact, both in the historical past and perhaps even today. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I'll aim to open up some of the following questions in the hope that we can discuss them together in the roundtable later. These include, is religious difference simply an aspect of racialization, one vector of race thinking or race making? Or is religion constitutive of difference in a way that complements yet is distinct from racialization? What is the nature of the relationship of religion and race in pre-modern European cultures? And does it differ from that same relationship in modernity? Beyond this, there's also the important question of how that relationship of religion and race might look, for example, in the Islamicate medieval world. This is not a question I'm going to try to answer, though there is some superb work in this area appearing recently, and maybe this is a topic that will come up in our later discussion. I'll begin in the first section of this paper by discussing the representation of the Magi and its connections through pictorial representation and biblical glosses to the genealogy of the sons of Noah, as part of an effort to illuminate the place of Ethiopia in the European Christian imagination. I'll situate that depiction of Ethiopia in the context of climate theory and its account of how bodily diversity comes to be, emerging from the landscape organically. In the second section, I'll turn to the context of Cologne in the 12th century, describing how the reliquary of the three kings came to the city and the establishment of their cult and its textual traditions. The three kings, or wise men or Magi, became the very heart of the city's self-representation. They connected Cologne to the first moments of the life of Christ on earth, adding the crucial vector of salvation history to the city's historical identity as a Roman colony that had matured into the heir to Roman imperial greatness. As a locus of trade along the Rhine, anchoring an immensely profitable region, Cologne was a crossroads in space as well as time. Its long-standing Jewish community, which is attested both in Roman times and throughout the Middle Ages, forms a crucial backdrop to the self-fashioning of the city that we see in the cult of the three Magi. In this part of the paper, I'll describe how the story of the three kings received its fullest elaboration in the mid-14th century Latin account by John of Hildesheim, a text that was soon translated into a wide range of vernaculars and spread the cult across a wide swath of Northern Europe. By juxtaposing the nexus of religious and racial identities in the Ethiopian Christian with that of the racialized Jew, I want to open up our own conversations about the nature of the relationship of religion and race. Finally, having explored that nexus in Ethiopian Christian and Jewish identities, focusing on the local environment of Cologne, I'll turn briefly to some of the recent work by the Cree artist Kent Monkman, which resonates with some of the imagery that we'll be exploring today. More generally, Monkman's work invites us and challenges us to reflect on how our subject positions and our physical location here in North America on Turtle Island might inform the way we choose to practice our shared discipline of medieval studies and offer some ways forward as we untangle our histories of race and racialization. I'd like to start with the land. This map shows the northeastern Atlantic coast. It appeared in its first version in 1651, but was updated and reprinted throughout the second half of the 17th century. We can tell that this particular printing of the map is from after 1682 because Philadelphia appears on the map at lower left in this close-up. Those of you who are familiar with the New York region will notice many familiar locations, and I'm going to move my cursor to see if this, do you see my cursor? Hopefully. You'll see here near the region labeled New Amsterdam, we see a number of other familiar locations. We see over here, Brooklyn, Jamaica, and Vlissingen, or Flushing. And over here on the New Jersey side of things, we see the cities of Milford, Bergen, and the Raritan River. We also see the names of native tribal groups, the Manhattans, the Sanhekins, and the Matavankans. Here at left, you see the place name, Magekisho, which is now the site of Trenton, New Jersey's capital city. Where I am right now in Princeton is just above that spot, near where you see the word Sanhekins. Early 17th century maps of this region show the Sanhekins up here on the Bayonne Peninsula, where Jersey City is and where the Holland Tunnel now links New York and New Jersey. The 1651 version of this map shows the Sanhekins in this central location, but this later iteration of the map that we see here from the 1680s shows them both in that central location and also here to the west, by where I am now. In other words, we see their displacement over time as reflected on the map. The Lenape tribes represented here now live in Oklahoma as the Delaware Nation and tribe, in Ontario as the Munsee Delaware Nation, in other communities in Wisconsin, Kansas, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, and in northern New Jersey, based at Mahwah as the Ramapo Lenape Nation, which is about up here. I wanted to begin with this map to situate myself in terms of the land I'm on and the positionality that comes with that fact, and also to invite us to think about the land and its relationship to people as we work through our histories of race and racialization. Medieval texts invite us to think about the relationship of people to the land they inhabit. We see this, for example, on the 13th century Psalter map, whose east-oriented map, east is at the top, depicts the so-called Monstrous Races located at the very fringe of the inhabitable world to the right. They are near the equator, where the heat of the sun makes the region increasingly inhospitable to life, and where the deformities and marvels appear in abundance, generated by the excessive warmth of the climate. East-oriented maps, however, only tell part of the story. This north-oriented climate map offers another perspective, one that shows both the northern and the southern hemisphere and divides the northern and southern temperate zones in a neat schematic way with a single torrid and an uninhabitable zone wrapped around the earth like a belt. This conception of climate underlies the treatment of bodily diversity that we find in encyclopedias and scientific writing, in which I'll illustrate today with reference to the work of Bartholomeus Anglicus, whom Cord already mentioned briefly yesterday. His De Proprietatibus Rerum, or On the Properties of Things, offers us an extended account of how the properties of various lands give rise to the properties, including anatomy, physiology, and even habits of mind, found in the people who live in these lands. Bartholomeus' encyclopedia is useful to us in two ways. First, because it was so widely disseminated, we can take it as representative of the kinds of general knowledge that were out there, both in the many manuscripts of his Latin text and the 14th century vernacular translations that circulated throughout Western Europe. The second way that the De Proprietatibus Rerum is useful to us is its systematic nature. It does not so much innovate as package, in a capacious and pleasing way, the complex discourse of bodily diversity that had developed from antiquity through the 13th century, with the reception of important parts of the Aristotelian corpus, along with translations of Arabic language, medical, and scientific texts. Before the 13th century, accounts of bodily diversity tended to rely on writers like Pliny and Solinus, who described physical anomalies in terms of climate, but not in a very systematic way. After the 13th century, however, with the reintroduction of Aristotle's writings, accompanied by the rich commentaries of Muslim philosophers such as Avicenna and Averroes, the scene was very different. It was no longer enough just to list and marvel at the wide range of monstrous races and fabulous animals. Instead, writers tried to categorize them, to explain exactly how their unusual features had come to be, and to explain how bodily differences such as skin color shaded off into monstrosity. The importance of climate and consequently native land in determining the natural diversity of mankind is emphasized in the astronomical and in the medical tradition. In the De Sphera, a popular treatise based on Ptolemy's cosmology, the astronomer Sacrobosco explains that Ethiopia must be located at the equator, that is, in the torrid zone, because, he writes, the inhabitants would not be so black if they were born in the temperate habitable zone. And you can see the two temperate habitable zones illustrated here to the north and south of the equator on the climate map. Sacrobosco's commentators, deeply interested in Aristotle's explanations of causation and change, elaborated on this passage enthusiastically. One early 13th century commentator adds a comment about the physiology of the people of Ethiopia. He writes, "An example of the blackening of Ethiopians is the cooking of golden honey. First it is golden, then it is reddish, and finally by long cooking it becomes black and bitter, and that which was at first sweet becomes salty. And it is just this way all over Ethiopia," end quote. He adds that their blood is drawn to the surface of the skin by the great heat, where it becomes, quote, black and bitter, and in this way it can be clearly seen why the Ethiopian is black. Bartholomeus Anglicus's contribution to this way of thinking was to systematize it. He integrates medical and astronomical accounts of how climate determines the properties of bodies within a geographical survey of the world. To put it another way, Bartholomeus took medical theories that distinguish between northern and southern bodies in general and applied them to a list of specific countries. And again, this way of thinking soon became widespread. The De Proprietatibus Rerum was hugely popular in its Latin original and in its translations, which were printed in early incunable editions. So it's kind of all over the place. And Bartholomeus' encyclopedia is very different from other examples of the encyclopedic genre. For example, his contemporary Vincent of Beauvais simply follows their 7th century model Isidore in giving his world geography, even though he clearly knows about Avicenna and Constantinus Africanus, and even quotes the relative passages about human biology from those writers. He just simply doesn't put the parts together to produce an account of bodily diversity as it is produced by climate. Bartholomeus, however, does. He notes the correspondence of climate to the properties of each land, and then draws out the correspondence of that land to the plants, animals, and people that inhabit it. Those of the northern countries, such as Albania and Almania, or Germany, he says, are large-bodied and fair-skinned, with blonde straight hair. Those of the southern countries, such as Ethiopia and Libya, have smaller bodies, with dark skin and, he says, crisp hair. Monstrosities, that is, bodies that are wonderfully and horribly shaped, are found here in the torrid regions where the excess of heat interrupts the proper dissemination of form. But Bartholomeus goes even further. In his geography, he emphasizes not just the diversity of mankind, but its balance, the way that each climate extreme, each geographical location has its opposite or its counterpart. So, for example, he writes of Gallia that by the diversity of heaven, the face and color of men and their hearts and their wit and their quantity of body is diverse. So Rome engenders heavy men, Greece light men, Africa guileful or deceitful men, and France naturally produces fierce men who are sharp of wit. In his entry on Europe, we can see the binary opposition that underlies this exuberant diversity and the hierarchical relation that emerges from that binary. He says, and I'm just giving you the Middle English text, figuring that was easier than giving you the Latin. If this part of the world is less than Asia, it is a peer to it with regard to number and nobility of men, because as Pliny says, the sun feeds men that are more huge in body, more strong in might and virtue, more bold in heart, more fair and seemly of shape than men of the countries and lands, either of Asia or of Africa. Because the sun abides long over the Africans, men of Africa, and burns and wastes humors and makes them short of body, black of face, with crisp hair. And because their spirits pass out from the pores that are open, so they are more cowardly of heart. And the contrary is true of men of the northern land. For coldness that is outside stops the pores and breeds humors within the body that makes men more full and huge. And cold, that is the mother of whiteness, makes them the more white in face and in skin. And vapors and spirits are smitten inward and made hotter inside, and so the more bold and hardy. This binary opposition of northern and southern bodies, their qualities predicated on the land that these bodies emerge from, is not particularly innovative. It appears in the Pentagni of Constantinus Africanus, as well as in the writings of Avicenna and Albertus Magnus. What is unusual is the way in which he praises the seemly bodies of the bold and hardy northern men and denigrates the southern men who are cowardly of heart. Here, not the temperate mean, but the northern extreme is presented as the beautiful and desirable ideal. This marks an important transition in the process of racialization, the emergence of a new phase in race thinking or race making, to use the terms that Cord Whitaker and Geraldine Heng, respectively, have used to describe the process of racialization in pre-modern literature. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I want to come back to the distinction between those two terms, race thinking and race making, to consider what different avenues of thought each one opens up. So I'll come back to that, and maybe we can talk about it as well. So on the one hand, this theory of how climate governs land and consequently governs all the things that grow from it, including people, seems ideal and even utopian in its harmonious diversity. On the other hand, we cannot forget that this theory also contains within it the elements of an intellectual system based on the relationship of climate to human physiology that could be used and would be used to justify the subjugation of peoples and the institution of slavery. As early as the 16th century, the philosopher Jean Bodin suggested that the principles of political administration should be tailored to match the predisposition of different national groups. In other words, Bodin suggested that the form of government would vary depending upon the tractability of each national group, whose behavioral characteristics were determined by the land that they emerged from, as affected by the climate. Here, Bodin uses Aristotelian notions concerning the role of climate in human development and applies them to the question of how to govern. By the late 16th century, Aristotelian climatic theories were being applied to the indigenous peoples of North America. These so-called Indians were supposedly identical to the Indians of India. They tended by virtue of their climate to be prone to disease, easily drunk like the Ethiopians, and generally debauched. Their extermination in the wake of European settler colonialism was thus rationalized as biological destiny. Finally, climate theory was used to explain the suitability of Africans for enslavement until climate-based explanations of their natural inferiority were replaced in the 18th century by theories predicated primarily on heredity. Bartholomew's encyclopedia was widely read, and we can see the impact of its account of how the properties of a land give rise to the properties of its people in another widely disseminated book, the Book of John Mandeville. Written in French just a century after Bartholomew's Anglicus Encyclopedia, and almost immediately translated into a wide range of other vernaculars as well as Latin, Mandeville's book builds upon its precursor by using climate theory to provide a sense of the underlying natural order of the world. Bodily diversity is accounted for both in terms of heredity and in terms of climatic influence, though climate continues to be the main focus. The existence of the so-called monstrous races is explained as the consequence of the curse placed by Noah on the descendants of his son Ham following the Great Deluge. Their monstrous Features, however, are explained by the natural consequence of the climates they come to inhabit in exile, the torrid extremes of Ethiopia and India. For each land described, its climate, which gives each land its distinct properties, is identified as the cause that determines the anatomy and physiology of the inhabitants. For example, in Mandeville's account of the land of the Pygmies, the people are said to be only a few spans in height, which is appropriate to their climate. But, the author adds, when men of normal stature come there to live, their offspring are also of a diminutive stature, like the Pygmies. The reason for this, he says, is that the nature of the land is such. Here, climate governs the physiology not only of the native inhabitants of the land, but also of those who pass through. The land affects not only those who have been there for generations, but those who come to live upon its soil. This suggests that, for Mandeville, the effects of climate are mutable. In other words, the bodily diversity of mankind is not essential, but changeable depending upon the environment. In this, Mandeville resembles Albertus Magnus, who in his De Natura Loci says that if you moved some Ethiopians from the first climate to the fourth or fifth climate, that is from the area of the equator to a more temperate climate, within a few generations they would be altered. Their offspring, he says, would have white skin and all the other attributes of northern climates. Albertus is unusual, however, in his very strict application of Aristotelian theory to human physiology. It's more common to see a mixture of climate theory and genealogical descent. We can see this, for example, in Bartolomæus Anglicus's chapter on Pictavia. Even though Bartolomæus generally sticks to a climate-based theory of human diversity, here he inserts heredity into his account of the properties of the inhabitants of this land. Their qualities appear to be a strange combination of what you might find in more northern and more southern climates. He says, however, that this is no wonder, because he says the men of Pictavia are of mixed descent. He says they're a combination of Picts and Frenchmen. They have the qualities of each nation, qualities that were first formed by the nature of the climates, Bartolomæus says, but then combined through heredity. So here he's got the two seemingly mutually exclusive theories of bodily diversity, climate and heredity, yoked together. Another apparently anomalous case appears in Bartolomæus' account of India, which is amplified further in the account of India that we see in John Mandeville. You'll remember that northern and southern climates produce extremes. The effects of climate produce bodily diversity that's at its greatest in the extreme north and extreme south, and more moderate and subtle in the in-between climates. As Bartolomæus puts it, in keeping with medieval medical theory, in the Northland men are high of stature and fair of shape. By the coldness of the outward air, the pores are stopped and the natural heat is held within. And by virtue of that, the stature is huge and the shape of the body is fair and seemly. And men of the south are contrary to men of the Northland in stature and in shape. Not just men, but also animals of the north are naturally large in size and white in color. In northern countries like Albania and Almania, therefore, the land is full of huge dogs and huge fair-skinned men, while southern countries like Ethiopia and Libya have dark inhabitants who are short in stature, with both men and beasts that are said to be wonderfully and horribly shaped. India, however, is even more wonderful than these torrid regions of Libya and Ethiopia, because it contains not only those monstrous races whose bodies are wonderfully shaped, and beasts who are also wonderfully shaped, but also another kind of wonderful sight. It has men of great stature, men whose appearance would be perfectly normal in the colder climes of the north, but which is dramatically out of place in the far south. Huge beasts and great hounds are found in the far north, not in the far north as climate theory would dictate, but, he says, toward Ethiopia. It's natural to find great hounds in chilly Albania, and indeed they do show up in that entry. The great hounds found in steamy India, however, are totally out of place. In the book of John Mandeville, this anomaly appears again. The author describes India as a land that contains men and beasts that are extraordinary, owing not only to their unnatural stature, but to their white color. In spite of the extreme heat, the narrator finds in India huge snails, great white worms, and lions that are white and as great as oxen. In Bartolomæus' account of India, and still more in Mandeville's account, the experience of wonder is occasioned precisely by the fact that the climate model is violated. In Bartolomæus' encyclopedia, and much more briefly in the book of John Mandeville, we've seen how climate theory accounts for the underlying order of the world. We've also seen, however, anomalies. One of these concerns the intertwined function of environment and heredity, as in the case of the people of Pictavia, who arise from the combination of two peoples, each people formed by a different land. The other anomaly we've seen concerns the appearance of features that violate the expectations of climate theory. In broader terms, we've seen the underpinnings of pre-modern race theory. Before the 18th century, when theories of race based on the role of heredity came to be dominant, writers produced climate-based explanations of the causes of bodily diversity that bear a close resemblance to those found in 13th and 14th century texts. From the 13th century to the late 17th, we find heredity and climate variously and inconsistently identified as the causes of bodily diversity. By the 18th century, however, we find a conception of bodily diversity that sees physical and behavioral differences as essential, fixed, and immutable. Well before the period of the European slave trade in Africa, a system of knowledge had been developed that would facilitate and rationalize the process. Europeans were ready to enslave Africans and exterminate indigenous people long before those acts were underway. In this case, at least, the discourse of race and the process of racialization came to exist before the exercise of power in the colonial setting. We've seen how medieval scientific texts and encyclopedias point out that different climates give rise to different species. Accordingly, creatures of the north tend to be larger and whiter, creatures of the south smaller and darker. Those of the north have their spirits driven within them by the cold, producing fierce and bold temperaments. Those of the south exude their spirits through their pores, producing lethargic and lascivious temperaments. Yet the discourse of climate theory is only one layer in the discourse of pre-modern race. It is, I would like to argue, intertwined with religious identity in a distinctive way. To be Ethiopian, as we have seen, is to be burned by the heat of the sun, to have a body that is the product of a particular kind of climate. But to be Ethiopian is also to inhabit a very specific place within salvation history. In theological terms, Ethiopia was understood as a place of special grace and apocalyptic expectation. In the Hebrew Bible, the story of Solomon and Sheba was interpreted in terms of a mystical union that brought the earthly Jerusalem into contact with the southern riches of Ethiopia. In the Acts of the Apostles, the queen of Ethiopia, named Candace or Kandake, was identified as the ruler of the Ethiopian eunuch who converts to Christianity. Apocryphal stories of the Magi also associate one of the three wise men with Ethiopia in a reassertion of the fundamentally tripartite division of the world found in medieval world maps and medieval encyclopedias. These texts divide the world into three parts: Asia, Africa, and Europe, to correspond to the three sons of Noah. Shem is associated with Asia, the biggest part, Ham, the outcast, with Africa, and Japheth, the youngest, with Europe. The three Magi recapitulate the sons of Noah, but while the sons of Noah are scattered outward into the wide world after the flood, their descendants populating each of the three continents, the three Magi come inward toward the sacred center of the Nativity. Let me illustrate this with a bifolium from a manuscript of Beirut of Libana's Apocalypse, where we see a depiction of the Virgin and Child, here closer up, with the Magi in a series of linked circles, plus the familiar form of the TO map at top left. Here's a close-up of the map. Note that the TO map includes not just the names of the three continents, but also of the three sons of Noah, as a visible reminder of the Old Testament prefiguration of the three Magi, seen at the right. Here they are. The economy of type and antitype is expressed in terms of word and image, with the names of the sons of Noah foreshadowing the vivid human forms of the three Magi. Depictions of the Magi vary in how they present the ethnic origins of each of the three kings. Some, such as the Beatus image that we see here, show exotic dress, but only moderate differences of physiognomy, while others, such as that found in the prayer book of Albrecht of Brandenburg, illuminated by Simon Benning, show bodily diversity more vividly, with black skin. Like the Ethiopian Magus, depictions of the Queen of Sheba, seen here at bottom right, also vary in how they depict ethnicity. While there was a rich commentary tradition on the Song of Songs that interpreted the allegory of the beautiful and black bride in historical terms as the Ethiopian Queen of Sheba, pictorial depictions of the encounter of Solomon and Sheba often show the queen as fair-skinned, as in this illuminated page by Simon Benning that faces his image of the Magi. The queen is attended by two other women, her attendance on Solomon and offering of gifts appearing as a counterpart to the offerings of the three Magi. To put it another way, a chain of typological prefigurations links various moments in salvation history, with each one of them rooted in an essential notion of Ethiopian identity. In one typological relationship, the sons of Noah prefigure and are fulfilled in the three Magi. In a second typological relationship, the encounter of Solomon and Sheba and the tribute offered by the Ethiopian queen to the king of Israel is fulfilled in the tribute offered by the Ethiopian Magus to the newborn king of the new Israel. The presence of Ethiopian identity as a key point of reference in salvation history was not limited to explicit citations from the Bible and Apocrypha, such as Solomon and Sheba, the three Magi, and the Ethiopian convert described in the Acts of the Apostles. It also appears in what we might call the secular strands within salvation history, where typological relationships continue to be central. These include the legend of Alexander the Great, which for medieval Europeans, especially in the 12th century, was central to crusading ideologies, and the fantasy of Prester John, the mythical king of a remote region who would one day come to the rescue of the Crusader armies in the Holy Land. As in the medieval scientific texts I've mentioned, as well as in the Encyclopedia of Bartholomeus Anglicus and the Book of John Mandeville, the Alexander romances use Ethiopia as a way to name the geographical limit case, the remote place of extremes. The Pillars of Hercules, marking the borders of the known world, are said to be located in this region, and the exotic queen of the Ethiopians, Candace, has an encounter with Alexander the Great. In some versions, but not all, their encounter is an amorous one. Several Alexander narratives explicitly associate Candace with the Queen of Sheba, following an account by Josephus that identifies her as the ruler of Ethiopia. Moreover, the name appears in the Acts of the Apostles to refer to the ruler of the Ethiopian eunuch who converts to Christianity. This intertwined lineage of encounters with Ethiopians, first in the biblical account of Solomon, also recounted in Josephus's history, second in the Acts of the Apostles and commentaries on it, and finally in the many versions of the Alexander romance, served to provide an image of Ethiopia that was paradoxically ancient and novel, with each encounter repeating a narrative of spiritual and material exchange. This was a geographical location, but one almost as deeply enmeshed in salvation history as Jerusalem itself. In the 12th century, the cathedral at Cologne became the site of the cult of the Three Kings, when the relics of the Magi were brought from Milan, where they had been kept since the 4th century. This was the last stop on an extended process of translation, elaborated in the legend of the Three Kings, where their remains were moved from their original place of burial to Constantinople after being discovered by Helena, finder of the true cross, then from Constantinople to Milan in the early 4th century, and finally from Milan to Cologne in 1164, when Frederick Barbarossa took the relics from the church of St. Eustorgio in Milan and gave them to the Archbishop of Cologne. Even today, the cult of the Three Kings suffuses every inch of the cathedral space, not just the reliquary itself, which you see in the background of the image at right, but also the image of the Virgin and Child attended by donors who reenact the giving of gifts by the Magi to the infant Christ. You see them at right. The images on the west facade depict the Magi along with other biblical figures, including the Queen of Sheba. Sculpted in the late 19th century by Peter Fuchs, they attest to the modern afterlife of the medieval cult. The stained glass windows, too, representing the Magi, include 13th century images as well as more modern renditions. The Chapel of the Three Kings within the cathedral was long the site of the reliquary, primary focus of the cult, but now the reliquary has been moved to a safer and more tourist-friendly location close to the main altar. The reliquary, seen here in the background, here from a distance, and here is a bit closer up, is built in the form of 3 golden coffins or sarcophagi united into a single tripartite form. The original parts of the shrine were designed in the 1180s by the goldsmith Nicolas of Verdun, and work on the structure was completed around 1225. The cult attracted rich donations, including the gold and jewels used on the front of the reliquary, which were given by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV in 1199. The gift of the 3 golden crowns became emblematic not only of the cult, but of the relationship of the city to the cult. The 3 crowns are on the city's coat of arms still today. This brief overview of the cult of the Magi at Cologne makes it clear, I think, how intertwined the veneration of the relics was with not only the status of the rulers who endowed it, but also with the archbishop whose cathedral housed the reliquary and with the city that surrounds the cathedral. This object captures some of the resonance of the cult, its aspiration to signal a kind of universal, worldwide authority. It's a precentor's staff, a symbol of rank used by the precentor of the cathedral choir. It was carried in procession when the choir would enter and could also be used to beat the time of the music. This one, dated to about 1200, is made of silver, partly gilded, with an orb made of rock crystal. At the top, it is surmounted with yet another image of the Magi, which you see at the center. Note how the orb reflects the whole globe, divided into three: the three continents, the three sons of Noah, the three wise men, united at the top into a singular moment of grace, the giving of gifts to the Christ child. It represents one moment in time and space that also stretches out to encompass all of time and space, relocating the singular point of the encounter of the Magi with Christ at the Nativity to Cologne, as that point of encounter is echoed over and over again with every visit and every gift to the shrine. This history, however, is intertwined with a second history, one that lines up with the cult of the three kings in a kind of eerie symmetry. Cologne was the home of a substantial Jewish community, both in antiquity, by the early 4th century, and through much of the Middle Ages. The community may have been continuous through that time, but archaeological evidence is still not completely clear on that point. Excavations in Cologne, seen here with the cathedral in the background, have revealed the extent of the Jewish quarter of the city, which was in the neighborhood of the Rathaus, or City Hall, stretching to the southwest along the Judengasse. The archaeological site exposes the layered history of the city, which I'd like to juxtapose with the history of the cult in this slide. It's not very detailed, and there's a lot to say about each of the events recounted here. What I want to point out today, however, is the extent to which the history of the cult of the Magi in Cologne is intertwined with the history of the city's Jewish population. And you see at left, events in Jewish history, and at the right, what's going on with the cult of the Magi. I'm not making an argument about cause and effect, even though I am thinking about Sara Lipton's wonderful lecture yesterday and the ways in which Christian identity in medieval Europe, particularly with regard to mercantile identity and economic factors, has often been constructed on the foundations of anti-Judaism. And this might be something we talk about later on. As I think you all know, the First Crusade began with the massacres of the Rhineland, starting on the 27th of May, 1096, in Mainz. Cologne followed in July, with the offer of forced baptisms or death. With the Second Crusade also came attacks on the Jewish people living in the Rhineland, first at Königswinter, followed by several other cities in the region, including Andernach, Altenor, Bonn, and Lechnich, but no violent assaults in Cologne, to the best of my knowledge. Renewed violence in the late 13th century, however, brought about the building of a wall to enclose the Jewish quarter, which the community was itself obliged to pay for. Anti-Judaism shaded over into anti-Semitism with the production of the Judensau, an offensive image of Jewish men with a pig. Cologne's cathedral contains what is the earliest known example of this motif, which soon came to be found more widely across German-speaking regions. It is carved in wood on the side of one of the seats in the choir between 1308 and 1311, and shows on the left side the obscene intercourse with the pig, and at right a blood libel scene. This is the same choir where the precentor would carry his staff and beat the time, adorned with the Magi and their gift to the child. The Judensau remains at the cathedral today, although you have to ask for a special tour to see it. I did not ask. Time does not allow me to talk in detail about the later history of the Jewish community in Cologne. The pogrom of 1349, the return of some of the community 20 years later, around 1370, clothing ordinances in 1404, and permanent expulsion in 1424. All I can do today is to situate the cult of the Magi and the important and influential text of John of Hildesheim within this context. For our purposes here, as we think about the history of racialization and the intertwining of race and religion, I want to emphasize the relationship of anti-Judaism with the figure of the Christian Ethiopian, both situated within Salvation history and both perennial, positioned within a particular moment in time, but also recurrent and iterative, continuously shaping and reshaping normative Christian identity. Cord Whitaker has written brilliantly about John of Hildesheim's text, and especially about the Middle English translations of that Latin work, so I will not attempt to retread that ground today. What I would like to do, however, is to point out the ways in which Jewish and Ethiopian identity shimmer, to borrow Cord's key term from Black metaphors, within that text. The Historia Trium Regum, or History of the Three Kings, tells the story of the Magi, not just in their encounter with the Holy Family, but their years afterward in the remote East, and their ultimate death and interment in a single tomb at Mount Vos. The opening chapters tell us a story of translation, not just the translation of the relics from Milan to Cologne, but earlier translations, both of bodies and of books. The kings are said in their old age to have chosen to be buried together in a chapel at Mount Vos. As the Middle English translation puts it, there they chose the place of their sepulchre by one accord. This shared tripartite tomb is the first iteration of what would become the tripartite reliquary of Cologne Cathedral. It also looks back in time, however, to the initial coming together of the Magi en route to Bethlehem. Coming from the remote corners of the earth, the three take different paths to the sacred center. They meet on the road and discover unity. And I put a bit of Middle English text, and the Latin corresponds to the second half of the Middle English. And so the three glorious kings with their companies and carriages, each from his own land and kingdom, by his special way, his own way, in this through way, this meeting way, thus met together. And although none of them before that time had any knowledge of one another, though even so, they rushed to kiss one another. And even though each one of them was of a diverse language, yet it seemed to each of them that the other spoke his language. And when each of them had showed to the other the cause of their coming, and in all things they had accorded in their intentions, then they were much gladder than before, and more fervent and energetic in their journey. The three paths converge into one in the through way, the common path where they share one entente, one intention. Their diverse languages are no barrier, because even though they are of diverse languages, they can all understand one another. This moment of convergence, where the three parts of the world meet in a single point of unity, is the antithesis of the biblical narratives of dispersal, the movement outward to populate the world by the sons of Noah after the flood, the scattering of peoples after Babel, their common language lost, the apostolic mission of Pentecost, where the gift of many languages leads to the preaching of the gospel throughout the world. This is a moment of fusion. I've tried to give a sense of the ways that religion and race are fused in pre-modern manifestations of race thinking, using the local environment of Cologne to anchor a wider history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and a history of veneration of the Christian Ethiopian. Both the Jew and the Ethiopian are understood in terms of bodily diversity, a history that I sketched out at some length today for the Ethiopian, and which I've written about separately regarding Jewish bodies in Idols in the East. Both are also understood in relation to normative Christian identity, the Jew as either virtuous typological precursor or a stiff-necked and blind enemy of Christ, the Ethiopian as Christian, yet exotic, of different confessional affiliation and associated with the remotest East. It's here that I find Cord's use of the term race thinking particularly useful, in the way it refers back at once to the medieval past and also to Hannah Arendt's use of that same term in her important article, Race Thinking Before Racism. This article, published in 1944, identifies race thinking as the 19th century precursor to the horrors of the 20th. Yet Arendt also makes room for the 18th century roots of this phenomenon, recognizing that it has a deep history. While Cord does not write about Arendt in his Black metaphors, he makes the debt explicit in the dissertation that lies behind the book. I find this connection both powerful and moving, reminding us of the ways in which the present is always connected to multiple moments in the past, in a kind of intertemporal web. It's in this spirit that I want to close by sharing a few images from the work of Kent Monkman, which continue the conversation about journey and convergence, the multiplicity of humanity, and the single boat that we inhabit. Monkman is a member of the Cree Nation, whose work draws upon the trickster figure of mischief to enter into historical moments and to recreate them with a focus on the experience of Indigenous people. I won't talk about his work in general, but we'll just share with you two monumental historical paintings that he recently completed as part of a commission from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. They are currently hanging in the Great Hall or entranceway of the Met, but only until November 20th. So if you haven't seen them and you're in New York, go. They're amazing. You don't see them as soon as you enter, but when you turn and look back at the Met Gateway, you see the two paintings to your left and to your right. The pair of paintings is called Mistikosewak, which means wooden boat people. And the image you see here, titled Welcoming the Newcomers, is on the left. The other, titled Resurgence of the People, is on the right. Here you see a full view of Welcoming the Newcomers. And here you see a full view of Resurgence of the People. Monkman's main frame of reference in iconographic terms is historical paintings, such as Washington crossing the Delaware, painted by Emanuel Leutze in 1851. Mischief stands in the place of Washington. Resurgence of the People also alludes to Delacroix's 1830 painting, Liberty Leading the People. Here, Mischief stands in the place of liberty, personified as a woman bearing a tricolor banner. Mischief bears an eagle feather. If we turn to the first of the two paintings that together make up Mistikosewak, wooden boat people, we see a different historical referent. welcoming the newcomers alludes to Jericho's 1819 painting, Raft of the Medusa, both in the gathering of native people on the landmass at the left and in the cluster of settler people clinging to the overturned boat at upper right in the background. The native people are endangered just at the point of being invaded by the settlers, who appear at once to be helpless supplicants and loathsome predators. Look, for example, at the extended hand of the man in the white shirt who reaches toward the newborn baby in its father's arms. In all three cases, the iconographic reference is to, first, founding myths of the nations, and to revolution. I won't talk about these aspects, rich as that analysis would be, but will instead just briefly point out an aspect of the paintings that I haven't seen commented on before, Monkman's evocation of the medieval. Let me draw your attention to the right-hand side of this image, where we see Miss Chief extending her hand downwards to aid the three figures in the water. Here's a close-up. The one in the foreground is white, wearing the helmet of a Spanish conquistador. The one at left is black, wearing the chains of an enslaved person. And the one at right appears to be Asian, wearing an exotic turban-like headdress. Miss Chief reaches her hand out in what Monkman, in a video on the paintings, describes as a gesture of generosity, expressing the way in which the first people welcomed the settlers to the so-called New World. But she also looks outward at us, across time, and with the knowledge of the destruction that these three apparently helpless victims will bring to her people. Looking at these three figures, it is difficult not to be reminded of other templates for dividing the world into three, some of which we've considered today. For example, we might compare the three continents of Asia, Europe, and Africa, as seen here on this schematic TO map of the world. Or we might compare Heinrich Binting's image of the whole world in a clover leaf, included in his 1581 Itinerarium Sacrae Scripturae, which shows the three usual continents of Asia, Europe, and Africa, along with, at lower left, Die Neue Welt, the New World. We might even recall the Magi attending the Christ child seen here in Simon Benning's painting, done in the 1520s, and here again in this anonymous late 12th century painting from Northern England, showing the Magi on the road to Bethlehem. This sacred geography, this vision of history, and this pre-modern conception of racial difference, grounded on the correspondence of land and people, are all called into question in Monkman's powerful historical painting. What would it mean to understand the people in terms of the land, not in the way that the race thinking of climate theory makes possible, but in the ways that indigenous knowledge keepers and artists suggest? This throughway, this path of convergence opens up possible futures, even as it sheds new light on the medieval past. Thank you.